You know, sometimes I catch myself just kind of accepting things the way they are without really thinking about, like, how they got that way.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's like,
definitely.
okay, like those big green highway signs we all see all the time, right?
Right.
Ever, like, stopped and wondered, like, who actually makes those things?
Interesting question.
Yeah. Turns out there's a good chance those signs were made by someone incarcerated in the American prison system.
Yeah, most people probably don't think about it, but prison labor is a lot more common than you might
Yeah.
realize.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly.
So today we are diving deep into the world of prison labor.
It's a fascinating system and definitely a controversial one.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to be looking at everything from like its history
Mm.
to the economics of it, how it actually works,
Yeah,
and of course the ethical questions that it brings up.
for sure there are a lot of those.
Definitely. So to kick things off, I was really surprised to learn that this whole system, it's been around for centuries.
Oh yeah, it goes all the way back to colonial times.
Wow.
Yeah, in the beginning it was mainly about convict leasing.
Convict leasing.
Yeah, basically prisoners were rented out to private companies.
As workers.
Yeah, essentially a source of really cheap labor.
That's kind of disturbing when you think about it.
Yeah, it was a system rife with abuse, really. And for a lot of people, especially in the South after the Civil War, it was basically a way to continue slavery under a different name.
I mean, it's really chilling to think about it that way.
Yeah,
And it's all tied to that exception in the 13th Amendment.
right. The one that abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime.
Exactly. It's like this seemingly straightforward law, but then it has these unintended consequences.
Huge ripple effects throughout history.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, that exception in the 13th Amendment really paved the way for prison labor to expand, especially in the South.
Right, where Black Americans were disproportionately targeted by the legal system.
Exactly. They would get imprisoned for minor offenses and then forced to work on chain gangs or penal farms.
That's a really dark part of our history.
Yeah, it's a chapter that still casts a shadow on our justice system to this day.
Yeah, I mean, that historical context is so important to understand how we got to where we are now with this whole system.
It's all connected.
So moving forward in time, right, the 1980s and 90s, you had this huge rise in mass incarceration.
Mm-hmm. The prison population just exploded.
And I imagine states were struggling to deal with the cost of all that.
Oh, absolutely. It was a massive financial burden, housing and managing all those inmates.
So that's when prison labor started being seen as a potential solution.
Right. The idea was that it could help offset some of the costs.
But of course, it's not that simple, is it?
No, definitely not. It raises a whole host of ethical and economic questions.
Like, are these programs actually helping to rehabilitate inmates?
Right. Are they giving them valuable skills?
Giving them a path to reintegration into society?
Mm-hmm.
Or is this just a way to exploit a vulnerable workforce for cheap labor?
That's the big debate, and there are strong arguments on both sides.
It's a very gray area.
Definitely not black and white.
So let's get into like the specifics here. What kind of jobs are we actually talking about when we talk about prison labor?
Well, the range is surprisingly diverse.
Okay.
Some jobs are what you might expect,
Like what?
cooking, cleaning, laundry, maintenance within the prison itself.
Okay, that makes sense.
But then there are others that go way beyond that.
Like what?
Well, like the inmate we mentioned earlier, Christopher Barnes, the one who makes highway signs.
Right? I never would have guessed that.
It just goes to show how deeply embedded prison labor is in our society.
Yeah, it really is hidden in plain sight.
Exactly. And he's not alone. Across the country, hundreds of thousands of incarcerated people are making products that we encounter every single day.
Like what kind of products are we talking about?
Oh, all sorts of things. They sew clothes, manufacture furniture, assemble electronics.
Wow.
They make components for license plate.
It's kind of mind-boggling to think about how much of the stuff we use might have been made by prisoners.
And it's not just work that happens inside prison walls either.
Oh, right. There are those work release programs.
Exactly, where inmates actually go out and work in the community.
Yeah.
Often for much lower wages than people who aren't incarcerated would get for the same work.
Wow, so they're competing with regular workers.
In a way, yeah. And they might be involved in all sorts of things like disaster relief efforts, agricultural work.
I remember during the pandemic, some inmates were even tasked with handling the transportation of bodies.
Right, because of the health risks. It was a job that a lot of people didn't want to do.
Yeah, that's a really difficult situation all around.
Absolutely.
So with all this activity going on, who's actually overseeing it all?
Well, it's not like there's one central organization managing prison labor across the entire country.
Okay.
Most states have their own systems in place.
Like what?
Well, in North Carolina, they have something called Correction Enterprises.
Correction Enterprise.
Yeah, it's basically a government-run business that utilizes prison labor,
To produce what?
all kinds of goods and services.
Interesting.
And a lot of those goods end up being sold to state agencies at much lower prices than they would pay on the open market.
So taxpayers are saving money.
In a way, yes, but of course that raises the question of whether those savings are coming at the expense of exploiting these incarcerated workers.
That's the ethical dilemma at the heart of all of this. And it's
Exactly.
something we're going to be exploring in more depth as we continue our deep dive today.
For sure, it's a complex issue with a lot of different perspectives to consider.
Definitely. So let's move on and hear from someone who actually lived and worked within this system.
All right, let's do it.
We're going to be talking to Brian Scott, who spent 20 years in prison working at a printing facility that was run by Correction Enterprises.
His story is really powerful.
Yeah, it gives us a glimpse into what it's really like to be a part of this world.
The good and the bad.
Yeah, the meager wages, the side hustles that prisoners come up with to make ends meet.
And the huge differences in conditions from one facility to the next.
Right, because it's not all the same.
Not at all. Each prison has its own culture, its own way of doing things.
So stay tuned. We'll be right back with Brian's story after a quick break.
Sounds good.
So it's pretty amazing, when you think about it.
What's that?
Like all these everyday objects we use without even thinking twice about them,
Yeah,
and they might have this whole hidden story behind them,
right.
like made by prison labor,
It's definitely something to consider.
for sure. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the economics of all this.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier that Correction Enterprises in North Carolina, they brought in over $121 million in sales last year.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a lot of money.
It is, especially when you consider that their labor costs are way lower than what private companies have to pay.
How much lower are we talking?
Well, for Correction Enterprises, their labor costs are only about 2.5% of their revenue.
2.5%.
Yep.
That's crazy low.
Yeah, for a typical private company, you're looking at something more like 25 to 35%.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is.
So essentially, taxpayers are saving money because incarcerated workers aren't getting minimum wage or benefits.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
But what about private businesses?
What about them?
Doesn't this create kind of an uneven playing field?
That's a good point. Some people argue that it gives an unfair advantage to companies that use prison labor.
Right, because they can undercut their competitors on price.
Exactly. And it brings us back to that ethical question we talked about before.
Right, is this system really about rehabilitation?